I couldn't believe what was happening. I was just pulling into my own driveway after a long day at work when I saw her. A woman standing near my front door, looking at me like I'd just done something terrible. It wasn't the first time I'd seen her, but today was different. This time, she wasn't just giving me a weird look. No, today she had a phone in her hand, and I could see her dialing something. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to be dragged into a mess I never expected. I had just finished a stressful day at the office, and the last thing I wanted was trouble at home. My house was supposed to be my peaceful sanctuary, a place where I could relax and unwind. But as I pulled into my driveway, the last thing I expected was to be confronted by my neighbor, or worse, to have her call the police on me for something as ridiculous as parking in my own driveway. It all started when I parked my car, just like I do every day. I was halfway to my front door when I noticed her, Karen, as I later learned. She was standing there, arms crossed, staring at me with a look of pure frustration. I thought maybe she was upset about something else, but then she did the last thing I expected. She walked up to me, and in a voice loud enough for me to hear from across the yard, she said, "You can't park there." I stood there, confused. I had lived in this house for over a year and had never had a problem with parking. It was a quiet neighborhood, and my driveway was clearly marked for my use. "What do you mean, I can't park here?" I asked, still not understanding what was going on. Karen, however, wasn't having any of it. "You're blocking my view," she snapped, her voice rising. "I can't stand it when people park here. It's a public nuisance." I was taken aback, trying to figure out how this was even an issue. Blocking her view? It wasn't like my car was parked in front of her house. My driveway was clearly on my property, and I had every right to park there. But Karen wasn't listening. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started dialing. "I'm calling the cops." "You can't just park like that," she yelled, as if I was doing something illegal. At this point, I was starting to feel a little overwhelmed. I mean, who calls the police on someone for parking in their own driveway? But she was serious, and I could tell from the look on her face that this was just the beginning of a confrontation I wasn't prepared for. Little did I know, this situation was about to escalate in ways I couldn't have imagined. As Karen continued to dial, I stood frozen, trying to process what was happening. My mind was racing. This couldn't be real, could it? How could parking in my own driveway be an issue? My house was at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. There was no reason for anyone to have a problem with my car being parked in my own space. But Karen seemed determined to make this her problem. I tried to stay calm. "Listen, Karen," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I don't know what's going on, but this is my property, and I have every right to park here." She shot me a look that could have frozen water. "Not when it's causing problems for the neighbors," she snapped. Her tone made it clear that she wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't just dealing with a neighbor here, I was dealing with someone who thought she had the right to tell everyone what to do. "I've lived here for over a year," I explained, trying to keep my cool. "And this is my driveway. No one has ever had an issue with it before. Why is this suddenly a problem now?" Karen ignored me, still focused on her phone. She must have called the police by now, because I could hear her telling them that someone was blocking the neighborhood and that it was causing a disturbance. At this point, I knew there was no way I was getting out of this without dealing with the authorities. It seemed absurd, but I couldn't back down. I had done nothing wrong. Moments later, I saw the flashing lights of a police car in the distance. The officer parked in front of my house, stepping out with a look of mild confusion. He looked around at the scene, trying to make sense of it all. "What's the problem here?" he asked, his gaze shifting between me and Karen. "She's blocking the view," Karen said, pointing at my car with a sense of urgency. "And it's causing a public nuisance. She parks there all the time, and it's not right." The officer turned to me. "Is this your vehicle?" I nodded, now feeling the weight of the situation. Yes, officer. It's my driveway, and I'm parking in my own space. I don't see how this is an issue. Karen interrupted, her voice growing louder. She's been doing this for months. It's unacceptable. Something needs to be done. I could feel my patience starting to wear thin, but I kept my voice steady. Officer, my car is parked on my property. This is a private driveway, and there's no law against parking here. The officer glanced between us, trying to make sense of the situation. It was clear to me that he wasn't sure what to do. Karen's complaints were so bizarre that I was sure he hadn't dealt with something like this before. After a few moments of silence, the officer spoke up. Well, he said, sounding a little uncertain, it seems like this is more of a neighborhood disagreement than a legal matter. I don't think there's anything illegal going on here. Karen wasn't about to let it go, though. This is ridiculous, she yelled, throwing her hands up in frustration. You can't just let her park here. She's disturbing the peace. The officer took a deep breath and turned to her. Ma'am, it seems like this is a misunderstanding. There's no law being broken here. I can't do anything about it. Karen wasn't happy with that answer, but she couldn't argue with the officer's reasoning. She huffed, muttering something under her breath, before turning and storming off toward her house. I watched her go, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief. How could someone get so worked up over something as simple as parking in a driveway? The officer turned to me and gave a nod. I think we're done here. Just try to keep it cool with your neighbors, all right? I nodded in return, grateful that this ridiculous situation was finally over. The officer left without any further issues, and I thought that would be the end of it. Little did I know, Karen wasn't going to stop there. This strange battle had just begun. The next few days were eerily quiet. Karen didn't come over again, and I thought maybe the situation had blown over. I figured she'd finally realized how ridiculous her complaint was and decided to leave me alone. But I couldn't have been more wrong. About a week after the police incident, I returned home from work to find a letter slipped under my door. I picked it up and noticed immediately that it was from the Homeowners Association, HOA. My stomach dropped. I had a bad feeling about this. The letter wasn't long, but the message was clear. It was a formal complaint about my parking situation. Karen had apparently gone over my head and reported me to the HOA, claiming that my parking was a disruption to the neighborhood. She even went so far as to say that I was creating a dangerous situation by parking too close to the street, even though my car was well within the boundaries of my own driveway. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was getting out of hand. I had a right to park where I wanted, as long as it was on my property. But now, it seemed like Karen had convinced some people on the HOA board that I was the problem. The letter threatened that they would be investigating the situation and possibly taking action. I immediately called the HOA to ask for clarification. The woman on the other end of the phone seemed apologetic, but it was clear that she didn't have much sympathy for me. We've had several complaints from your neighbor, Karen, she explained. She says your parking is affecting the neighborhood's safety. We just need to look into it. I tried to keep my cool. But this is my property. There's nothing illegal about parking in my driveway. I'm not blocking anyone or causing any safety hazards. She sighed. I understand, but it's a concern for the HOA. We have to follow up on complaints. I hung up the phone feeling frustrated. I couldn't believe that Karen was doing this. She was making mountains out of molehills, and now the HOA was getting involved in something that wasn't even a problem. I started researching HOA rules and found that they didn't have much power when it came to private property. Still, I had to prepare for whatever was coming next. The next day, I received another letter from the HOA, this time requesting a formal meeting. They wanted me to attend a hearing to discuss the issue and resolve the situation. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I had to stand my ground. The meeting was set for the following week, and I spent the next few days gathering evidence. I took photos of my driveway, showing how it was clearly on my property and well within the lines. I even got in touch with a few neighbors who I knew didn't have an issue with where I parked. They agreed to support me if things went south. When the day of the meeting arrived, I walked into the HOA office, my nerves on edge. The room was filled with people, some of whom I recognized from around the neighborhood. Karen was sitting at the front of the room, glaring at me as I walked in. She looked smug, like she already knew she had the upper hand. The board president, a man named Mr. Harris, called the meeting to order and briefly explained the issue. He said that the HOA had received multiple complaints about my parking, particularly from Karen, and that they needed to discuss it. Karen quickly chimed in, "I'm just trying to protect the safety of the neighborhood. This parking situation is unacceptable. It's dangerous, and it's affecting everyone who lives here." I couldn't believe how she was twisting the truth. I was just parking in my own driveway. But I kept my calm and raised my hand to speak. "I'm the one who lives here," I said, addressing the board. "This is my property, and I'm well within my rights to park where I want, as long as it's on my land. There are no safety issues here. I've parked this way for over a year without any problems." Karen shot me a nasty look, but I wasn't backing down. The board members looked at each other, clearly unsure about how to handle the situation. One board member, a woman named Mrs. Bennett, finally spoke up. "But Karen says this is a public safety issue. We need to take that seriously." I took a deep breath. With all due respect, Karen is exaggerating. I've spoken with my neighbors, and no one has ever complained about my parking. This is a personal issue that she's trying to blow out of proportion. There was a moment of silence in the room as the board members processed what I said. Karen wasn't giving up, though. She stood up and slammed her hands on the table. "You're all making a huge mistake," she shouted. "If you let her get away with this, she'll keep doing whatever she wants. You have to stop her." I couldn't believe how far she was willing to take this. But I wasn't going to let her push me around any longer. "I'm not the one causing the problem here," I said, standing firm. "I've done nothing wrong, and I'm not going to let her or anyone else tell me what to do on my own property." At that point, Mr. Harris spoke up. "I think we've heard enough. We'll need to review everything before making a decision. But it seems to me that this issue is more about personal grievances than anything else." Karen's face turned bright red with anger, but the board members seemed to be siding with me. The meeting ended with no clear resolution, but it was clear that Karen was losing her grip. I had stood my ground, and the HOA had no real case against me. The days following the meeting were filled with a sense of uneasy anticipation. I knew Karen wouldn't just let this go. She had been relentless from the start, and now that she had the HOA on her side, I had no doubt she would keep pushing. But there was something different this time. I could feel that the board wasn't as convinced by her claims anymore. They had seen through the exaggerations, and I was hopeful that the situation was nearing its end. A few days later, I received a letter from the HOA. It wasn't unexpected, but the contents were something I hadn't anticipated. The letter stated that the board had reviewed the issue and concluded that there was no violation of any HOA rules. They acknowledged that the parking was on private property and that there were no safety concerns. They apologized for any misunderstandings and assured me that no further action would be taken. I couldn't believe it. After everything Karen had put me through, the HOA had finally sided with me. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but at the same time, I knew that Karen wasn't going to take this loss lying down. I wasn't naive enough to think she'd just back off. In fact, I was certain that this wasn't over. Sure enough, the next day, I got another call from Karen. Her voice was full of anger, and I could hear the frustration in every word. "You think you've won?" she yelled. "You're wrong. I'm not done with you. The HOA might have backed down, but I'm not giving up. I'm going to take this further." I couldn't help but laugh a little, the absurdity of the situation finally sinking in. "Karen, you can keep trying, but you've lost. The HOA made their decision, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's over. You'll regret this," she shouted, before hanging up on me. I wasn't worried. In fact, I was almost relieved to see how far she was willing to go to hold on to a losing battle. At this point, I knew she was just trying to intimidate me. She had already exhausted her options. But just to be sure, I took a few extra precautions. I reached out to a lawyer to make sure everything was in order and that I was fully protected. I wanted to make sure that if Karen tried to escalate things any further, I'd be ready. A few weeks later, I received another letter from Karen. This time, it wasn't a personal threat, but a formal demand. She claimed that I was violating some vague community agreement by parking the way I was and that I had to remove my vehicle or face legal consequences. The letter sounded like it came from a lawyer, but when I read the fine print, I realized it was just another empty threat. I wasn't intimidated. I knew that Karen had no legal grounds to stand on, and her threats were nothing more than an attempt to make me back down. I consulted my lawyer again, who assured me that the HOA had no authority over private property, and Karen had no case against me. With the situation seemingly settled, I thought things would finally calm down. But then, to my surprise, I received a call from a local news station. They had gotten wind of my story and wanted to interview me about the HOA and Karen's persistent attempts to control my property. I wasn't sure at first, but after thinking it over, I realized this could be the perfect opportunity to set the record straight. The interview was scheduled for the following week. When the news crew arrived, I explained everything that had happened, from Karen's false accusations to the HOA's involvement. I made it clear that I had every right to park on my own property and that Karen was simply using her position on the HOA board to bully me. The reporter seemed genuinely interested in the story, and the interview went smoothly. I even showed them the letters from the HOA and the ridiculous demands Karen had made. The next evening, the story aired on local news. I wasn't expecting much, but when I woke up the next morning, my phone was flooded with messages. Friends, family, and even some of my neighbors reached out to tell me how much they admired my stance. They were shocked at how far Karen had gone with her complaints and appreciated the fact that I stood up for my rights. The public support felt great, and I was finally able to breathe a little easier. But the real twist came a few days later. Karen called me again, but this time, she wasn't yelling or threatening. Her tone was almost apologetic. "I saw the news," she said. "And I realize now that maybe I overreacted. I've been told by some of the other neighbors that I took things too far. I'm sorry." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After all the drama, after everything she had put me through, Karen was actually admitting she was wrong. She even apologized. It was an unexpected turn, and I wasn't sure how to respond. I had been prepared to keep fighting her, but now, it seemed like she had come to her senses. "I appreciate the apology," I said, trying to stay composed. "But just know that this situation should never have happened in the first place. I'm glad we can finally put this behind us." Karen agreed, and we hung up. I felt a strange sense of closure. The story had come full circle, and the situation that had once felt like an ongoing nightmare had finally reached its end. A few weeks passed, and things seemed to return to normal. Karen didn't bother me again, and the HOA moved on to other matters. I had won the battle, not just for my parking rights, but for standing up to someone who thought they could push me around. The road was finally clear, and for the first time in a long while, I could park in my driveway without a second thought. It felt good to know that no matter how difficult the situation had gotten, I had stood firm, and in the end, I had my rights respected. Several months passed, and life in the neighborhood seemed to return to normal. The tension between me and Karen had all but disappeared, and for the most part, I was able to live peacefully again. But every now and then, I would catch myself glancing over at my driveway, remembering the bizarre and unnecessary battle I had fought just to park in my own space. One afternoon, while I was relaxing at home, I got a message from a neighbor I hadn't spoken to much since the incident. It was from Jack, a guy who lived a few houses down from me. We'd exchanged pleasantries here and there, but we hadn't really become close friends. His message caught me off guard. "Hey, just wanted to let you know, we saw the news story about Karen and the whole parking issue. I know it was a tough situation, but I wanted to say you did the right thing. A lot of people around here were talking about it, and I think it helped put things into perspective for some folks." I couldn't help but smile a little. It was reassuring to know that I had some support, even from people I didn't know that well. It turned out that Jack wasn't the only one who had been talking about it. A few of my other neighbors also reached out, expressing how they respected the fact that I had stood up to Karen in her over-the-top complaints. It was nice to feel like I wasn't alone in the situation, even though I had felt isolated when it was happening. It seemed like Karen had become the subject of gossip in the neighborhood, too. People were starting to see through her attempts to control everything around her, and some of the other homeowners began to avoid getting too involved with her. It was a little strange to watch, knowing how much of it had stemmed from a simple misunderstanding about parking. But at the same time, it felt good to know that my stance had made a difference. One thing I had learned from all this was how powerful standing up for yourself could be. It was easy to feel intimidated by someone in a position of power, especially when they had the backing of the HOA. But in the end, I had proven that knowing my rights and sticking to them was the best way to handle the situation. Even when Karen tried to escalate things, I refused to back down. And it paid off. As for Karen, I didn't see much of her after the apology. She kept a low profile, and while there were still some whispers about her around the neighborhood, it seemed like she had learned to pick her battles more carefully. I didn't have any more run-ins with her, and honestly, I was fine with that. The last thing I wanted was more drama. Looking back on the entire ordeal, I couldn't help but chuckle at how absurd it all seemed. Who knew that parking in my own driveway would spark such a massive conflict? But in the end, it wasn't just about parking, it was about boundaries, respect, and standing up for what was mine. It wasn't an easy road, but I felt like I came out of it stronger. Now, when I pull into my driveway, I can finally relax, knowing that I'm not dealing with any more ridiculous complaints. The road is clear, and I have the peace of mind to enjoy my home without fear of being called out over something as simple as where I park my car. Sometimes, I still wonder if Karen ever regrets the trouble she caused over something so trivial. But at least I can confidently say that I'll never let anyone push me around like that again. The driveway is mine, and no one can take that away.